Hi everyone, welcome back to English 229. This is for our class for Monday, the 24th, where I wanted to talk about Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. I also wanted to talk about some upcoming assignments as well and some changes onto the syllabus. So if you were to look at the notes below, and this is the second to the last section, Section 12, Assignments and Due Dates. You'll see that I've returned your second journal on Edgar Allan Poe. So if you've not received that journal, please let me know. Journal number 3 on Jekyll and Hyde is supposed to be due on the 24th at 11:59 p.m. So that would be today if you are watching this video on the 24th. But I will extend that up until Wednesday the 26th if necessary, because today we're talking about Jekyll and Hyde. And of course, you would be submitting that via PDF the way you usually do to my email, Ruiz, R-U-I-Z, @gcc.mass.edu. And that means that I wanted to give an extension for the first paper as well. And I will extend it up until Monday, November 7th, by 11:59 p.m. via PDF, again to my email, Ruiz, R-U-I-Z, @gcc.mass.edu. Though certainly you can hand it in early. And the idea behind the first paper is that you will address one of the earlier texts in the semester. So you will probably either talk about Frankenstein, or you will talk about Edgar Allan Poe, or you will talk about Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. And then our second paper, which is due at the ending of the semester, would deal with one of the texts that we are going to be doing in the latter part of the semester. So that would probably be either Dracula or Lovecraft short stories, or perhaps Shirley Jackson, The Haunting of Hill House, which is coming up, and finally, The Exorcist. I also made an error on our syllabus that you might have noticed, that I had our Halloween class scheduled for Wednesday the 26th, which is absolutely absurd because we are meeting on Monday the 31st. So I'm going to switch those two classes around. So on Wednesday the 26th, instead of the Halloween class, what we will be doing is introducing the idea of Dracula. And then on Monday the 31st is when we will have our Halloween class. Notice I don't have anything assigned for you to do for that class, just to come. And talking about Halloween, if you are a fan of Halloween, the Lava Center, which is on Main Street and downtown Greenfield, will be hosting a presentation. And actually, I'm the one who will be giving that presentation. That's Friday, October 28th. From 6:30 to 8:30, where I'm going to talk a little bit about the history of Halloween, and also we're going to be doing a screening of The Exorcist, which is one of the texts that we will be addressing over the course of the semester. So I encourage you to come. It's a free event, and I'll remind you again next class if you are interested. And where we are is talking about the strange case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. And as you noticed, the film version, most film versions are quite different than the texts themselves. And one of the reasons why, I think, is because of the homoerotic possibilities within the text. It's a text that's completely filled with bachelors. And it also is a text that also is a commentary on Victorian society, which was highly repressed. Now, you'll notice that in some of the notes below, I've indicated that, first of all, the title is usually shortened. It reminds me very much of Frankenstein, where the true title is Frankenstein or the Modern Prometheus. We say Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. The true title ultimately is The Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. This story is as much a mystery story as it is a Gothic tale. And that makes sense because Edgar Allan Poe has been credited with creating the modern mystery story in the way that we think of it. This text, a novella, which means that it is longer than a short story, but it is shorter than a novel. This text very much is not only a detective story, a mystery that needs to be solved. But also, there are references to medical issues. And Stevenson was in poor health, so it oftentimes is assumed that there are some biographical elements within this, as we see lots of parallels with the contemporary issues of drug addiction, for instance, where we have a Dr. Jekyll. Doctor is supposed to represent the epitome of respectability, especially in Victorian period. But we were told that he was wild in his youth. So, despite his appearance of respectability, there is a underbelly. This novel is very much about or novella is very much about the hypocrisy of Victorian society. Note that in Danish, Jekyll means icicle, and you can think about Victorian society too in that respect. That there is that very cold exterior, and then, of course, the inner passions that are burning that want to be released, which we see in the Mr. Hyde persona. Mr. is very different in terms of title than doctor. Mr. would just be a gentleman, as opposed to a doctor, which would be a status of profession. So he has no a professional status. Hyde, of course, is a pun on the idea of hide, Hide, to conceal, because Dr. Jekyll is really concealing his true self under this persona of respectability. Hyde, Hyde, also works as a animal skin, and when we think about the idea of an animal hide, the sense of Dr. Jekyll being much like an animal, and we can read this text as a kind of commentary on reverse Darwinism, a kind of regression, if you will, on evolution to our ape-like and ancestral nature. If you know that Hyde in Danish means haven, and of course, Mr. Hyde is supposed to be the haven for Dr. Jekyll to be able to have his pleasures but not risk his reputation. His appearance as Mr. Hyde is supposed to reflect his persona, that he's pale and dwarfish and very much like a troglodyte, this idea of reverse evolution again. It's also smaller, perhaps the idea that evil diminishes an individual. Note all the references to doors and windows. This is something that we will also talk about with The Exorcist, where they oftentimes are entrances or exits into the psyche. If you know if you know Sigmund Freud, then you know some of his theories about personality and how well they work for this particular text. Freud arguing there's an id, an ego, and a superego. That the superego is about reputation and wanting to, and conscience, and wanting to keep outward appearance. And then the id is our base instinct, our animalistic nature. And the ego tries to balance the two. And in Victorian period, you didn't really have a or you didn't really have an ego. Really, what you embraced was the superego, at least in polite society. Of course, Victorian society was known for having an ugly underbelly. It was quite active at night. It was known for having a thriving prostitution trade, and that meant that sexual diseases were rather rampant at the time period. And again, that goes in direct contrast to the Victorian ideal of repression and sex merely for procreation, not for pleasure, and certainly monogamy within marriage. And I think all of that is addressed by Stevenson in the world that is portrayed, even in the home that Dr. Jekyll shares with Mr. Hyde. Notice that there are two doors, and one is the respectable side, and one is the rather seedy side. There's no bell or no knocker, this sense of wanting to remain isolated We know that isolation is always a bad thing in the world of the Gothic. In fact, we'll talk about this when we get to Dracula as well. And talking about Dracula, we will be spending the next several classes talking about Dracula. It is our longest novel of the semester. It's probably the most difficult part of the semester because it's mid-semester, and again, it's our longest text. I actually think of Dracula as multiple texts within the same volume, and I'll talk a little bit about that when we get to Dracula, so that might be helpful to you in terms of being able to approach the text. But I encourage you to start reading now because Dracula is our longest novel. Luckily, we also have our Halloween class that's embedded in there as well. So that'll give you a little bit of additional time to prepare for Dracula. And as we've been doing with the text thus far, we'll talk about film. Bela Lugosi basically made the role of Dracula his. So whenever we think of Dracula, we think of, in effect, the 1930s portrayal by Bela Lugosi. So I'll talk a little bit about that as well. But going back to Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, some of our other characters, Dr. Gabriel John Utterson. Notice that he utters or tells the tale. I think that's very much a wink and a nod to us. And Gabriel is the Christian archangel. And the idea is that Gabriel John Utterson is supposed to represent the epitome of Victorian society, the epitome of respectability. But we see he leads a rather hollow and empty life that I'll talk about in a few moments. So I don't think we're necessarily supposed to have an ambition to duplicate his life. Also, he likes to spend time with people who have questionable reputations, which makes one wonder just how reputable is John Utterson. We also have a hasty Lanyon. We could say that perhaps he's a little bit too hasty to judge Jekyll. And references to Queer Street. Now, queer meant odd at the time, but I also went to the Oxford English Dictionary, which is considered to be the definitive dictionary of all dictionaries, because it gives a historical review of how language was used through time. It's really the ideal reference when you're working with Shakespeare, for instance, because language would have been used differently during Shakespeare's time than it would be in contemporary time. And the Oxford English Dictionary will give you a definition. Oftentimes it's multiple pages long, so that you can see how that word was used differently over time with examples. The Oxford English Dictionary lists the word queer as a sexual reference in the early 1900s. We know this text was written in 1886, so it is possible that perhaps queer could have had a sexual innuendo element to it during the time period. We do know, as I had referenced earlier, about the Jack the Ripper murders that occurred just 2 years after this novel was written. Not that the novel was written in response to the murders, but one could argue that the novel perhaps helped to inspire some of the murders, where 5 women were killed. Again, lots of speculation as to who Jack the Ripper was, and no definitive answer, though usually it's concluded that because of the nature of the murders, that they were done very precisely with what seems to be a surgical instrument, that a doctor could have been perhaps the murderer and taking out some of his sexual frustrations in the underground Victorian prostitute trade. But again, we don't necessarily know that. But we do know that there are a good number of homoerotic references in this text. Not just the fact that we have a text of bachelors, not just the fact that we have a queer street that could be a sexual reference, not just the fact that the murder of Sir Danvers Carew occurs, and one suspects that it's because Sir Danvers Carew has some information that Dr. Jekyll in the guise of Mr. Hyde would not want revealed. But just think about the idea of doors that I was referencing earlier. The front door, which is respectability, and the back door, which leads to the seedier side of town. But you can also see that as a sexual reference, the back door being reference to a kind of sexual behavior through the back rather than through the front. So usually this text is read that way, but Hollywood wants to clean things up, and usually what it does is not only does it change the narrative by supplying a love interest, it supplies two heterosexual love interests, as we saw in the version that I had assigned. Usually it's considered to be the definitive version of Jekyll and Hyde. And one of the things that I wanted you to consider for today's attendance question, that'll be due on Wednesday, the 26th at 8 a.m., though certainly if you need additional time, please let me know, is not just the film version that you watched, but thinking about Jekyll and Hyde as a whole, the text in particular. Which element of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde do you think has the most contemporary relevance in our society, and why? And again, the film version is quite different than the text version, but both versions deal with the idea of hypocrisy and Victorian repression. So going back to the idea of examining Jekyll and Hyde and its commentary on Victorian repression and the hypocrisy that exists, and its psychological analysis of repression. Think about how twos, and we talked about how this is very common in the world of the Gothic, the idea of duplicity or doppelganger. But duplicity, of course, is about doubling, and that is something that perhaps we can see in all of the Gothic texts that we have read and will continue to read over the course of the semester. The two-door house, the side-by-side of wealth and poverty. And the Victorian society was a society of extremes, of extreme wealth and extreme poverty, often literally living side by side to one another. The two personas as Jekyll and Hyde, and note that he dies as Hyde. The movies give us something different, perhaps because they're trying to give us this happy ending. The two handwritings that need to be analyzed. Dr. Lanyon's letter to Utterson. So there's an interior letter that's supposed to be opened upon Jekyll's death or disappearance. This was very much in the trend of the epistolary novel that we've talked about previously, about getting information through letters. And we'll see this in Dracula as well. And then we finally get Dr. Jekyll's narrative to Utterson, but that's through the letters. Utterson is a terrible detective. He needs basically all of the facts given to him in order for him to solve the mystery of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. Some points about Victorian society in reference to the text that I think are fascinating. Early on, it's told that killing was out of the question, so the mob threatened Mr. Hyde with scandal instead. Notice that their first go-to is like, perhaps we can murder him. This is after he tramples a little girl, which is supposed to be a reference to violence. Again, a little girl is supposed to represent innocence. Utterson was, quote, this bachelor lawyer who's, quote, never lighted by a smile. He avoided enjoyment of theater and vintages and retired gratefully to bed, dutifully walking with Mr. Enfield. And again, this idea that we're not supposed to want to emulate Utterson's very sad and empty life, where he avoided enjoyment of things like theater and vintages and retired gratefully to bed because life was such a burden. And he walks dutifully with Mr. Enfield, which of course begins our narrative about what they witness, what they discuss. And Mr. Enfield and Utterson don't necessarily enjoy each other's company. They do this out of a sense of duty, which is very much typical of the Victorian society. And Enfield talks about how he didn't want to ask any probing questions because he's got a sense of delicacy. Again, this was very Victorian, the idea that you don't want to tarnish someone. And of course, the best way to hurt somebody, would not to murder them, would be to threaten them with scandal. The violence, the trampling of the girl on that black winter evening. Again, notice the setting, the black winter evening, to sort of give us the sense of tone of the kind of persona of Mr. Hyde. And Sir Danvers Carey murder, which occurs later with this ape-like fury, again, reference to a kind of reverse Darwinism. The films will oftentimes utilize makeup that is very ape-like, and some have even said somewhat racist. And I can let you make that decision if you've watched other versions of Jekyll and Hyde, but certainly I think we can see that somewhat in the version that I had assigned to you, which was also in the 1930s, which was a very pivotal time for horror film. If you think about the 30s was really the beginning of American horror film. Dracula is considered to be the first American horror film, though in the 1920s, The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari is considered to be the first horror film. And think about the tensions going on in the 1930s, the need for escapism because of the Great Depression, but also trying to grapple with the horrors of World War II. I'm sorry, with World War I, and not realizing that World War II would be following shortly thereafter. So whether this is a morality tale, because of course we do see that he dies as Mr. Hyde, that he's not able to control his transformation, that evil overtakes him, much like a drug addiction, that you develop tolerance over time so that you're not able to control it. And we see the differences in physical as well as emotional elements, that the physical body deteriorates, and the emotional element is that this becomes basically another kind of individual, one that is driven merely through addiction. Or you can see this as perhaps a supernatural tale, because I have been arguing that these are the major supernatural tales in the Gothic tradition, specifically Frankenstein, Dracula, Dr. Jekyll, Mr. Hyde. For Dracula, it's pretty clear to see the supernatural elements, which we will talk about when we talk about vampirism, though vampirism can also be seen from a symbolic perspective. With Frankenstein, we talked about how perhaps it was more in the realm of science fiction, but that there were still elements of the occult, because Victor Frankenstein is embracing some of the great occultists of his time, and also is spending his time in charnel houses, basically acquiring dead limbs. So, and certainly the descriptions are quite gothic. It's a little bit more difficult to find the supernatural element in Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, but I would argue that the salt that's referenced that he uses in his concoction for his transcendental medicine is what gives us the supernatural element in this tale. And that salt has many connections with the supernatural. It's supposed to basically help to defeat evil. It's one of the reasons why salt is oftentimes thrown on ground that has been polluted by evil. And salt becomes important with the Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde transformation, because it turns out that the salt that Dr. Jekyll was using was impure. Of course, if it had been pure salt, he probably wouldn't have had the ability to transform into something that was evil and unnatural. So I would argue that this reference to salt and all of its associations with supernatural elements, even spilling salt on a table with the old superstitions about making sure that you throw some salt over your shoulder to combat evil, would work in this respect. And certainly there are scientific elements associated with this. Is it possible to actually create another physical persona, much like there are scientific elements associated with Frankenstein? But think about the idea of what really Halloween is about. It's about taking on another persona, certainly not necessarily acting out one's evil desires, but using the mask and what is behind that mask. And of course, this entire novel talks about what is the behind the mask of respectable Victorian society. Or I should say novella again, because it really isn't a novel. It doesn't have the length of something like Frankenstein, and certainly not something like Dracula. So as I indicated, I should have returned your Poe journals to you. Hopefully that would perhaps give you some ideas about possibilities for pursuing a paper. As you know, I grade the journals informally on a checkmark system, not evaluating for grammar or mechanics, just for content, where plus is excellent and check plus is very good. Check is satisfactory. Though you might elect to write on Frankenstein, or you might elect to write on Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, where in theory your journal is due today, but I will give an extension so that you've got a little bit of additional time if you so wanted to take that time, if you wanted to listen to this lecture, this video and dissect some of what's going on. So you can submit in your journal on Jekyll and Hyde on the 26th on Wednesday, again via PDF to my email. And I am extending paper number 1, but I'm hopeful that you are busy working on paper number 1 at this particular point. That would be due on the 7th of November with the extension. Of course, if you needed an individual extension, you can ask me. But certainly by November, we are getting closer to the ending of the semester rather than the beginning. So I wanted to make sure that we had a formal writing assignment. That's via PDF to my email again, ruiz@gcc.mass.edu. And everybody has the option of rewriting that first paper. So I will be evaluating it for grammar, mechanics, as well as content. And this time putting a letter grade on it. But if you're content with your grade, then you're done with the assignment. If you wanted to try to earn a higher grade, you could do a revision by incorporating my comments into your revision. And if you weren't sure necessarily how to proceed, you could always meet with me as well. And I ask that you submit in the original graded copy along with your revision, and that you do so before the ending of the semester. So you've got a little bit of time to think about how to go about revising that first paper. And you get the higher of the 2 grades, which is really the way professional writers write, because they usually get editorial commentary and feedback, and they incorporate that. Your second paper will be due at the very ending of the semester, so there really wouldn't be time for you to revise. That said, there is the possibility of negotiation. I've had other students do so in the past, where they've been able to submit in their paper early enough so that I could return it to them so that they could do a revision if they so wanted to. But again, that's not something that's guaranteed. It's something that we would have to work out together. Your revision for paper number 1 is guaranteed. So, as I indicated for our class attendance question, and this is for Wednesday, the 26th at 8 a.m., which element of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, and I'm thinking more of the text, though certainly you can reference the film as well, do you think has the most contemporary relevance in our society, and why? I hope you're doing well, I'm doing well, and we will continue on next class. Take care. Bye-bye.